Now that you've had a chance to meet each other, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Donna Calco, the Executive Director of the Center for Public Leadership. And I'd like to begin with a few remarks. First, I want to say that today would not have been feasible without the partnership, the deep partnership that the Center for Public Leadership has with the Ken Blanchard companies. They are not only financial sponsors, but they have been an integral part of this program, and I can't begin to thank them enough for their help, and in particular, Pat Sigarmi and Wendy Wong. Secondly, we do have generous support from the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust and the Charles Hotel. This day has really evolved into not only the objectives that David has set out for us, which are very ambitious, but it is a culmination of the work that is demonstrated by our center and how important it is to be in the leadership development business, to be in the study of leadership, to be in the creation, the developing of young leaders to go out and change the world. So I want to just end on one note in terms of the overview for the day. I want to remind you that at the end of the day, we have a wonderful cocktail reception that you're all invited to, and that upon conclusion of the day, we'll need about a half an hour that we're going to give you a chance to sort of check your Blackberries and do your kind of thing, and then join us back here for a 2-hour reception. We're going to have so much happening on that, and I can't wait to see you all there, meeting with the students and meeting each other. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the audience in this room. Every voice counts today. We have mature and rising leaders from all generations, from all parts of the country, including a few from overseas, from all ethnic, political, and religious persuasions, and from all sectors, public, nonprofit, and private. Now, before I teach you how to use your table responders, I'd like to review some procedural issues. Because our time is constrained, our introductions of speakers will be brief. The comprehensive biographies of our esteemed conversation participants are included in your packet. If you haven't already noticed, there are cameras in the room to record the proceedings of the day. Our intent is to promote further discussion of today's leadership questions by posting live on the CPL website tomorrow. In fact, we are launching our CPL blogging site today and encourage all of you to stop by during the day and during the reception and respond to the messages and post your reflections of the day. I challenge all of you here in my generation to take a crack at this form of expression. I know you have cell phones and Blackberries. I'm going to ask you a big favor. See if you can unwire yourself for one day and simply enjoy the experience of meeting one another and being a part of a unique happening. For audience participants, we politely ask you to raise your hand. A microphone will be handed to you. Then please stand and state your name, affiliation, and face the stage. This is for the cameras. Okay, now for the fun part. How to use your table responders. The instructions are included in your packet and are up on the screen, and it's easier to use these communicators than your TV remote control. Now, let's practice. Here is our first question. How many years have you been eligible to vote? For those of you who are math challenged, subtract 18 years from your age. And there's no lying now. All right, you have the choice of selecting 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. All you do is push the number. Are you ready? Okay. Select now. If you see valid on your communicator, that means you did it right. If you want a chance to change your age, you can clear and put a new age in. we doing here? Got 168. That sounds probably about right. There are those who probably don't want to confess. That's my guess. Okay. So you can, good grief. I just heard over here, good grief. So you can see we really are balanced today in terms of ages, which quite frankly I wasn't sure how that was going to turn out. And I think that speaks to our aggressiveness in terms of diversifying this room, and I think it's terrific to see that we are what we claim to be, sort of a snapshot of America. Okay, your second question, it's a little more complicated. What is your role today? Now we have 9 options before you: student, university, consultant, corporate, small business, nonprofit or charitable, public sector, government, media, and other. All right, now you're going to select one number. Okay, are you ready? Select now. Okay. Well, as you can see, we've kept our word in terms of the student population. We are at Harvard. Of course, you're going to have a lot of university people here, and that the corporate. But we have worked very hard to try to diversify this audience, and I think that this gives you an idea of who's here today. You did a great job. I'm really impressed. I'd like to invite the participants in Conversation 1 to come up and get seated on the stage. Is Larry Summer here? Yes. Oh, great. All right, Larry Summer, Graham Allison, Roger Porter, and Joe Klein. Once again, I welcome David Gergen. David is the director of the Center for Public Leadership, a professor of practice at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a presidential advisor to 4 former presidents. You all see him more frequently than we do when you tune into CNN on a regular basis. It is my privilege and honor to introduce David Gergen as the moderator of Conversation 1.
Good morning again. And thank you. And we're going to get going right away. We have a wonderful panel. And the idea again this morning is for this panel to really talk to us substantively about the challenges that face the next administration, the next president. And then we will go on to talk as the morning goes on about the qualities we'll be looking for in the next president, the questions about leadership and so forth. If this panel has reflections on any of those issues, of course that will be welcome. But we're here primarily to set the stage so we all know how serious the agenda will be for the next president. And what I'm going to ask them to speak in this order, Larry Summers, then Graham Allison, Roger Porter, and then Joe Klein. And I will introduce each one of them. Now, I've asked them to speak maybe 5 or 6 minutes. I may engage them in a couple of questions. Then we're going to have a few minutes of conversation among ourselves, but open this up to the floor and try to close this all off by 10:15 or so. So that's the theory, and it's I think given this panel, I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. Larry Summers, I think all of you know, is a legendary figure not only on this campus but all over the world. He is now the Charles Eliot University professor at Harvard. He was the 27th president of this university, a tenure that many of us look back upon with great fondness because of his vision and strength that he brought to that office, and a vision that continues to guide this university today. Since leaving, and he has a long and glittering record as an economist. I think most of you know that. The youngest professor appointed as economist, but he got this award that gets given every 2 years to the best economist in the world under 40. I don't know, I think he was 4 when he got it. I'm not sure what age it was. But in any event, Larry has, since leaving the presidency and teaching here, and being affiliated both with the Kennedy School and the Business School, he has actually started a column with the Financial Times that has become a must-read in trying to understand what is happening to our global economy, what is this deterioration we've seen here, the credit crisis, the mortgage crisis, what do we think about it, where does it go? The New York Times wrote not long ago that in Asia, he was the single most influential voice coming from America. He was the voice that people in Asia most looked to understand the world around him. So Larry, thank you for being here, and tell us about what you do see then ahead for the next administration. Where are we and where is this heading?
David, the privilege is mine. Thank you and thank everyone else who's been involved in convening this important forum. I am old enough now that this is the 11th presidential election that I have followed closely. Every one of them was coupled with substantial statements from all kinds of worthy people to the effect that this was the most important presidential election in the last 2 generations, that America stood at a unique cusp, and there had never been a more important presidential election. That proposition has become a cliche. Sometimes cliches are right, and I think there is a very good chance that that statement is right with respect to the economic issues at the present time. I've been involved in, at least to a modest degree, in planning for a new presidential term 4 times. The Dukakis presidency that did not happen, 2 Clinton presidencies, and the Gore presidency that did not happen. I believe there is a strong case to be made that there are 5 issues that will be immediately on the plate of the new president, each one of which is as consequential or more consequential than whatever was the top issue on the plate of most previous presidents. And since time is short, I just want to identify the 5 issues. First, the cyclical and financial situation of the American economy. This, from a financial perspective, there are some who are starting to argue that we're past the 7th inning stretch. But from the perspective of the real economy, the strains associated with the current recession have just begun. There will be substantial policy for the new president to undertake, and the new president will face the challenge of thinking about the interconnection between the financial system and the rest of the real economy. We have a financial system that has brought us the 1982 Latin American debt crisis, the 1987 stock market crisis, the 1990 S&L crisis, the 1994 Mexican financial crisis, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 1998 LTCM crisis, the 2000 and 2001 NASDAQ bubble collapse, and Enron, and now this. It's probably time to think about its structure and its regulation, and that task will fall to the next administration. Second, inequality. Inequality has been a concern. Bill Clinton ran for president talking about inequality. The statistics in recent years have exploded, and the trend towards increased inequality has accelerated. Here's some numbers. If you take the top 1% of the population versus the bottom 80%, because it turns out that the middle 19% there hasn't changed very much. and you ask, how different would America be if we had the same income distribution that we had in 1979? Here's how different it would be. The bottom 80% would have $640 billion more, or $8,000 per family. Their incomes would have grown twice as rapidly over the last generation. The top 1% would have had $640 billion less, $500,000 per person less, and that's what we're seeing. A transfer each year of $500,000 to the top 1%, $8,000 from the bottom 80%. Does it matter more generally? Here's another fact that I actually find more disturbing than the income facts. CBO did a report on life expectancy and economic and social class. The gap between privileged Americans and less privileged Americans in life expectancy over the last generation has increased by about 1.8 years. To put that in perspective, if you eliminated all of cancer, it would add only a little over 2 years to life expectancy. So we have seen a change in relative life expectancy that corresponds nearly to the equivalent of cancer. I'm getting the gong, so I'll be quicker.
Is that, I understand, the 1.8 is the gap?
What is the change in the gap? It used to be in the range of 2 years. Now it's in the range of 4
almost
years.
4 years.
Yeah, and that 2-year change is sort of, if you took the people in this room and you doubled our cancer mortality rates, that would take about 2 years off our life expectancy. So it's a quantitatively very substantial number. Third, this is also an issue we've heard before. The demand has never been greater for U.S. economic leadership to support a more open global economy. And the taste for global leadership among our citizenry has rarely been less. Successful foreign policy in the United States is bipartisan. It is only a small exaggeration to suggest that in one of our great political parties, it is impossible to muster enthusiasm for any international organization. And in the other of our great political parties, it is impossible to muster enthusiasm for trade agreements. Without trade agreements and international organizations, international economic policy is, shall we say, impoverished. And yet, at a time when life expectancy in India and China, at a time when the incomes of India and China are likely to increase 100-fold within a single human lifespan, the demand for American leadership in structuring the global economic system has never been greater. Fourth, healthcare. I'm proud to say that I was in the international section of the Clinton administration in 1993. But I would also note that almost everything that was said about what would happen if nothing passed turned out to be true. There are far more people without health insurance. The cost of healthcare, which was then a terrible 12% of GNP, is now 16% of GNP. The relative performance of the United States in life expectancy or any other health measure has deteriorated. And if you ask what the single largest reason why businesses relocate to our border countries, Canada and Mexico, the single reason they give most frequently is they don't have to pay health insurance premiums on the same scale that they do in the United States. We're now talking about a sector that is larger than manufacturing in the American economy, and simply letting it rip is not working. Finally, there are the very difficult set of issues around energy and around, and the healthcare thing, by the way, is also the key to the entitlements, long-run fiscal health question. Finally, there are the set of issues around global warming, energy security, $120 odd dollar oil. Remarkably, and actually to my surprise when I studied it, I thought that at least $120 oil was going to assure that we were making a fair amount of progress against global warming. At least it would have that side virtue. It turns out that because global warming is heavily about coal, and because higher priced oil leads to some switching towards coal, that it is not having that benefit to any important degree. What we're able to do with respect to energy security and with respect to global warming will also be crucial to the questions of international leadership. Just a final comment, if I may. Sometimes the main problems facing the country are problems where everybody more or less knows what the right solution is on a bipartisan basis, and it is a formidable political problem to achieve it. That's the case, for example, with getting major budget agreements together that balance the budget. I would argue that's the case with respect to social security. You could put Democrats in this room together with Republicans in this room, and they could work out a plan that would be reasonable. What adds to the challenge that the next president will face is that in each of those 5 areas, it is not entirely clear what it is that needs to be done. The problem is a substantive one of requiring creative political energy, creative intellectual energy, even before it becomes a political challenge. That may be a bad thing, but if there's a silver lining in it, it is precisely because the answers are not clear, that there is the prospect of bringing a lot of people in on the ground floor to work together and think these problems through, and therefore to become stakeholders in the ultimate solution.
Larry, that's terrific. Let me have 2 quick follow-ups on this. In terms of presidential leadership, given the number of challenges the president will have to reform policy, how much of a hole will the president be in because of this economic downturn? How deep do you think the deficits may be? How much is that going to, in effect, tie the president's hands or handicap the president in dealing with these other reform issues?
First the economics, then the politics. I think that when people look back on this episode a decade from now, there are 3 possibilities. I think it's about 20% that they won't understand what all the excitement had been about in 2007, 2008. It was a really dramatic event on Wall Street and for a bunch of mortgage traders, but in the fullness of it all, it just wasn't. It just worked itself past. It didn't even turn into a recession, or it turned into the mildest of recessions. I think there's about a 60% chance that this will have been a way important financial event, but will have been a once a decade kind of adverse economic event, like the recessions that we had in 1990 and like the recessions that we had in 2001. And I think there's about a 20% chance that this will be the kind of economic event that my grandchildren, my children being 18, that my grandchildren will learn about in their high school history books 30 or 40 years from now, if the vicious cycle sets in. So there's nothing more important for the president than taking out effective insurance policies against our having a Japan-like experience. And while that's not the most likely thing by far, it cannot be ruled out. In general,
how do you do that? How do you do that?
You do that by erring on the side of more fiscal stimulus. You do that by finding ways of, through some combination of bribery and pressure, forcing financial institutions that are now badly undercapitalized to take on substantially more capital. You do that by achieving with more effectiveness than has been to date more domestic demand-led growth in the rest of the world, so that as our demand declines, demand from the rest of the world continues to propel the world economy forward. As things move more in that direction, the emphasis on Roosevelt-style pragmatic experimentation increases, and the emphasis on sound fundamentals for the long run surely decreases. I would say that to date, the Fed has been, while coming a little bit late to the party, has been highly creative and pragmatic in responding to rather difficult circumstances. I think the political leadership has been a little more back on its heels in responding to this situation, particularly if we have a serious next 6 months. I think that the new president is going to have to project energy. I don't think it's all a bad I mean, one would rather not have the whole problem, obviously. But I think I think it's important to try to look for silver linings in all these things, because it's optimism, not pessimism, that works. And the optimism is that people's feelings and state of mind are much more about rates of change than they are about levels. And even if things aren't terrific in the spring of 2009, if they are improving at a reasonable rate, that can be an important source of energy for the new president in carrying out a variety of reforms.
Good. Terrific. Let's turn to Graham Allison. Graham is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government and Director of the Belfer Center here at the Kennedy School. Graham has been thinking about issues of foreign policy and decision making for more than 30 years. His book, The Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, was published in 1971, was a classic in the field, has sold over 400,000 copies, is one of the best-selling books in political science, has been used by people thinking about leadership for a long time. But Graham went on from there. This was he was another wunderkind, as was Larry. He has served in several administrations on national security issues. He is very highly respected in this institution because he was dean of the Kennedy School from 1977 to 1989. When this was a fairly small program, it grew 20-fold under his leadership to become a major professional school. And in recent years, Graham has focused and has now become an international authority, just was called to the Senate to testify about issues of nuclear proliferation. His book on nuclear terrorism has become a classic already. It was recently published, and it's regarded as one of the most notable books of the 21st century. So, Graham, thank you for coming here. I'm sure we go on from Larry's rather very optimistic view of where we find ourselves. I'm glad Larry looked for the silver lining. But Graham has been thinking about other transcendent issues of our time. Graham Allison.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a great opportunity to be here as part of the panel and also as part of the leadership program and center that David and his colleagues have been building. So I'm happy to participate. I don't know, I think Joe Klein is going to finally have some optimism because I think I'm not going to make you feel more comfortable than Larry did. Larry focused on the economic dimensions of the challenges for the new president. I'm going to focus on the international challenges, and they're mammoth, so I'm going to concentrate on one particular subset of these, which I think will be extremely challenging, and these have to do with the whole state and structure of the global nuclear order. Larry, when he was reminding us of the number of presidential administrations for which he prepared that didn't occur, I remembered that I've prepared for even more. And I was remembering a memo that I wrote and gave as an eyes-only copy to John Kerry in 2004 as the international challenges that he was going to inherit. And I said in that, the good news is that you've won. The bad news is that a realistic assessment of the inheritance would lead the victor to envy the vanquished. And I think that's even more so today. So whoever becomes president in 2009 is going to inherit a situation that's almost beyond the capacity of any human beings. And I think they're going to think from time to time, whoa, what did I get myself into? I think this is not Kennedy succeeding Eisenhower. This is closer to Roosevelt succeeding Hoover. I think this is going to be an extremely difficult time. I think Larry's proposition about this is a cliche, yes, but I think this is a time when it applies. Larry focused on 5 issues, so I'll pick 5 issues too quickly. Immediate challenges specifically are Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. And the generic issue that I'm focusing on here is the global nuclear order. And the proposition would be present at the unraveling. If you want a great book to read to kind of get some perspective on challenges, I would recommend Dean Acheson's wonderful memoir called Present at the Creation. Acheson was the deputy secretary to George Marshall in the Truman administration and then Secretary of State in the period in which, after World War II, the U.S. faced a situation actually internationally as challenging as the situation today, but from a very different inheritance. And in that period, with imagination that we now call and we now celebrate as the work of the wise men, created basically the whole order that produced the longest period of peace, that is, no additional world wars, and prosperity ever seen historically. So this created NATO, the US-Japan alliance, the IMF, the GATT, the World Bank. So all of the structure that all of us grew up in and lived through, and the strategy that ultimately won the Cold War was part of this creation. My proposition 1 would be present at the unraveling of a significant piece of this global order, namely the global nuclear order. Now that's a long subject, but in brief, Kennedy, when he was president, forecast that on the current trajectory, by the end of the 70s, you would have 25 nuclear weapon states. He put forth that forecast in order to motivate behaviors that would prevent business as usual. They actually did. We had ended up with a non-proliferation treaty. According to this, 183 countries have forsworn nuclear weapons. There's a whole structure. That structure is basically unraveling. And so in the excellent report of the UN high-level panel for Kofi Annan, they say the non-proliferation regime is eroding to the point of irreversibility, beyond which there'll be a cascade of proliferation. I'd say that's the chapeau. Iraq, quickly. Iraq, we can't win, and we can't afford to lose. And that's what the new president is going to find. I've got a case that we did for my class this spring, which I'll give you copies of, and then if people are interested. So you're the new president, you're a Democrat, it's December, you turn to your trusted advisor and you say, I've got to think about Iraq and our national interest. I need 3 strategic options. Option 1 is what I said in the campaign. We're going to start withdrawing a combat brigade or 2 a month, and over 16 months we're out. And tell me the pros and cons of that, and then give me 2 more options that might better address American interests. I'd say that's the problem the person's going to have, whoever it is. Point 2, Iran. Wherever Iran stands, it's 7 years closer to its nuclear goal line than it was when President Bush became president. In 2006, there were 0 centrifuges operating in Iran. Today, there are 3,300. In 2006, Iran had enriched no uranium, and we said they would never be allowed to master the technology of enriching uranium. They've enriched 75 kilos of low-enriched uranium. So Iran is seriously on the road to a nuclear bomb. That problem will come to the new president, and he or she will find a situation in their first term likely in which they'll have to choose between acquiescing in Iran getting a nuclear bomb and attacking to prevent it. 3, North Korea, score 8-0. Kim Jong-il, 8. Bush, 0. When Bush became president, North Korea had 2 bombs worth of plutonium. Today it has 10 bombs worth of plutonium and has conducted a nuclear weapons test. If you have 2 bombs worth of plutonium, the likelihood of you selling 1 is pretty slim, and in any case, it's not been demonstrated. If you have 10 bombs worth of plutonium, the difference between 10 and 9 is inconsequential, if the difference would be $500 million to you. Finally, Pakistan. Supreme irony. President Bush entered office with a madman and a beard in a medieval country called Afghanistan, conducting training camps for mega-terrorist attacks on the U.S. behind a sanctuary of sovereignty in Afghanistan. And he's going to leave to his successor this same madman with his same deputy and a reconstituted set of lieutenants with training camps preparing mega-terrorist attacks on the U.S., but they've moved next door into a nuclear weapon state, Pakistan, which is unstable. So I think the victor will from time to time think about what he inherited.
Sobering. I want to ask you about Iran, because that seems to be the looming issue on so many people's minds. I take it that whoever the next president, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, will launch a diplomatic offensive to try to head off Iran from getting nuclearized weapons. How likely is that to succeed? How much do we need Russia to succeed in that regard?
Extremely good question, and I think another kind of generic, and I think Larry mentioned it but didn't discuss, is the unrealism of Americans and American politics and American elite demands on what's acceptable. So you get repeated things that pass as policy, not only from the Bush administration, but I would say here, both candidates, or all 3 candidates, in which policy consists of describing desirable behaviors by other governments that we give them lectures about and hope that they should do even when they're not in their interests. So with respect to Russia and Iran, there's no solution to stopping Iran short of a nuclear bomb without deep Russian cooperation. And therefore we induce deep Russian cooperation by what? Lecturing them about their domestic politics, installing missile defenses in Czech and Poland, what they regard their neighborhood, actually designed, we say, to protect against an Iranian nuclear bomb, which of course if they were cooperating in preventing an Iranian nuclear bomb wouldn't be a threat, which leads them to suspect that we might have other aspirations. We then talk about, and if it were not for the good sense of Mrs. Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, we would end up having Ukraine and Georgia on a fast track to NATO membership. Also something that's getting into Russian, their judgment of their interests. So inducing other states to behave in ways that we want them to behave will require some prioritization. And we don't like to prioritize. So we say, with respect to Iran, no, you cannot have nuclear weapons. And we continue to make statements of this kind, which I think, one always wonders about political leaders. I remember this both when I worked in the Reagan administration and when I worked in the Clinton administration. I would think, is he deluded or just disingenuous? And which would I prefer? So we continue to say Iran will not get nuclear weapons because it will not be allowed to run centrifuges because it cannot master enrichment technology. And I just go look and see what's happening. And I notice that there's 3,300 centrifuges there, and they do seem to be working, not always very well. But they are producing low-enriched uranium, which would be, quote, having mastered a technology. And we continue to say that is not, I don't know, it's unacceptable. It's impossible, we say, or, you know, making gestures. So I think that a new administration will, I think, likely come to this fork in the road, in which an advisor is going to come to him and say, Mr. or Mrs. President, actually there are now only two choices left.
And that's
When you
the choice.
you're going to see Iran emerge as a nuclear weapon state, and here's all the consequences of that, or you can attack Iran, and here's all the consequences of that. I think whichever of these two options you've examined most closely, most recently, is worse than the other one. And I think if we were to look at this issue now, we would say, hey, we have two unacceptable alternatives. We should be extremely inventive, including being willing to compromise in other dimensions, what you said with your question, to try to prevent this from happening. Unfortunately, we continue fussing with ourselves about what kind of strategy we're prepared to have, and they just sitting there working, making new facts on the ground every day. So by the time this gets to the table of a new president, let's say they're 6 months into office as they're getting their act together, Iran's not going to have 3,300 centrifuges operating, it's going to have 6,000. And it's not going to have 75 kilos of low-enriched uranium, it's going to have a couple of hundred, maybe more.
Larry?
Interesting aspect of human behavior and the way people react to things that helps to explain why this is hard. One of my jobs as president of Harvard was to try to mobilize resources and start new things done in new ways at the university. And I found something very interesting. If I actually had the resources, and the resources were there, and it was clear that I had them, and I went to people and I said, look, we got this new money to do things in a new way, people were enormously responsive to doing them in a new way. But if what I said was, you know, we have a chance of getting some significant new resources, but it requires you to agree and us to say we're going to do things in new ways, then people thought, nah, too hard, too risky, too something. I might end up compromising my principle and not getting my objective. And the difficulty we have as a country in achieving what you want to achieve with respect to Iran is, I think if you said we have to make this concession to the Russians, and then the Russians will really be in a strong position with respect to Iran, and Iran won't get nuclear weapons, I think it would be almost effortless to achieve the consensus. The problem is that the problem is never structured that way. It's, we have to make this concession that we will feel, see, and find painful today, and then we might be in a better position to get the Russians to do what they want to do. And so the fact that it's a known cost in the short run and a speculative benefit being offered by someone who's not entirely trusted makes it very difficult to achieve the desired outcome. That doesn't resolve the problem, but I think it helps to explain some of what seems like irrationality.
Good, thank you. Let's move along to Roger Porter, and who is now the IBM Professor of Business and Government. Roger's a great citizen of this university, also serves as Master of Dunster House at this university. He has served in senior domestic policy positions, economic and general domestic policy, in the Ford, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush administrations. He and I have been colleagues on more than one occasion. Most recently, and he was the senior domestic advisor to President Bush, number 41. And there, among many accomplishments, not only moving along the whole idea of standards and accountability in public education, was also there when a major renegotiation of the Clean Air Act was accomplished with a Democratic Congress. Roger was the person who put that together, so he's deeply schooled in environmental issues as well. And I should tell you that one of the many things I like about Roger is the strong family he's raised. He is one of only 2 examples in history of being the father and having a son, both of them being Rhodes Scholars. Roger Porter.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a delight for me to join this panel, and I am impressed with the size and the quality of those who have turned out to listen to and to discuss what are the challenges facing the next president. Charles Dickens began his novel about the French Revolution with the phrase, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And we often tend to put the situation in which we find ourselves in the most dire and striking of circumstances. David will remember when a president he worked for, Richard Nixon, exited, and the first president that I worked for, Gerald Ford, came into office. And I would just remind us all that at that time we faced a country that was deeply divided, with the first president having resigned in disgrace from office, mired in a war halfway around the world that was highly unpopular and largely unwinnable. We had experienced the first bout of double-digit inflation during the 3 months before Gerald Ford took office. The wholesale price index was increasing at an annual rate of 37%, the most explosive outburst of inflation in our history. Unemployment was rising, and we were at double-digit levels with respect to interest rates. So while we face big challenges now, I am cautiously optimistic, as I sense Larry is, that we do have the resilience to rise and meet those challenges. What are those that are going to greet the next president? One big challenge he's going to face is that he inherits a budget that is now in excess of $3 trillion. We've got about a $14 trillion economy, and we're now devoting about $3 trillion of it to government spending. It sounds like a lot of money, but what has changed over the last 40 years is that instead of roughly 70% of that budget being devoted to what's called discretionary spending that goes through the appropriations process, in which you make choices each year as to how you're going to allocate it, now about 70% of that budget is devoted to net interest payments and spending on so-called mandatory or entitlement programs, in which effectively the amount of control that you have over that pattern of spending is far less. If you think about organizations that are great organizations, they tend to be organizations that are flexible, adaptable, agile, and that can redeploy their resources quickly to the most efficient uses. We have now worked ourselves into a situation with respect to the federal budget where we have far less flexibility than we had several decades ago, and that is going to be a challenge that the next president is going to have to face. The big problem with that is an enormous amount of this entitlement spending is going to that portion of the population which are now part of the 78 million baby boomers who are coming into the eligibility time of their life where they're eligible for these programs. So addressing those, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, or other programs, civil service retirement being another major one, means that he or she is going to face a big challenge with respect to what to do on the entitlement front. Secondly, we have been prepared to tax ourselves at roughly 18.5% of gross domestic product. The average for the last 40 years has been 18.6%. We're currently taxing ourselves at 18.5%. There seems to be something endemic in the American political culture which says we're prepared to give roughly a fifth of the pie to the federal government to spend, but we don't want to give a lot more. Now, that's not a problem if you're only spending 18.5% of GDP by the federal government. But what has happened now is that we have an appetite for spending which exceeds that, And we do not have procedures put in place, like were put in place in the early 1990s, that effectively cause our political system to live within its means. And as a result, we are now potentially moving into a period of time when we're going to have a slowdown in economic activity, which will reduce revenues coming in, and at the same time we've got a spending machine that is charging away, which could contribute to the challenge that we face as to what are we going to do to fill this gap. And the way that we have been filling this gap in the past has been borrowing from abroad. We've gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation, and over the long haul that is not a very promising path. Thirdly, one of the great keys that has been assisting the American economy over the last half century since we came out of the Second World War has been the global trading system. And global trade over this 50-year period has been growing about twice as rapidly as the global economy as a whole. It's been one of the great engines pulling us down the path of prosperity. We are now moving into a period in which, as Larry pointed out, U.S. leadership around the world in the global trading system is desperately needed. We have been struggling for the last 7 years to bring to a successful conclusion the Doha round. And now what we face is a trade system in the United States that's starting to come unraveled, with the challenge to that feature of our trade laws, fast track authority, what's typically been known as fast track authority, being challenged by the Congress now, which wants to effectively remove it. It will be impossible for the United States to effectively negotiate trade agreements abroad with partners unless they think they're negotiating with someone who is in fact the final negotiator. And one of the things that is holding our economy up right now is exports. And we do not want to find ourselves in a situation in which we are turning to a protectionist path, which could in fact be another major impediment to the economy. Fourth, we have got a huge energy problem. And we have a huge energy problem as a world because as growth happens around the world, more and more energy is consumed. China has doubled their energy output in the last 6 years. They are on a path, as is India, in which they are likely to have higher and higher levels of demand for energy. And as a result, we are not finding new energy sources as fast as the demand for energy is going up, and this is going to potentially lead to continued sharp increases in the price of energy. The next president is going to face, what do we do about this challenge, not only domestically, but what do we do globally? One final thing, because I know we're running short on time and we need to get to the audience, but let me raise one other issue that it seems to me the next president's going to have to think about. We now have a federal workforce, military and civilian, which is aging, in which we are going to have a fairly large number of the civilian employment in the federal government retiring. The next president is going to need to find ways in which to make working in the government attractive to the best and brightest of the rising generation. Because if we are going to devote roughly a fifth of our gross domestic product to the activities of the federal government, we want the people who are engaged and involved in managing those programs and running those activities to be among the best and the brightest. And that means we're going to have to try to make work in the public sector attractive to individuals so that we can have the quality in the public services that we provide be on the order of what it is that we deserve as a country.
Thank you, Roger. Roger, the Goldman Sachs last week said that the price of oil might hit $200 a barrel within the next 24 months. how would that change your calculations of what the next president would face?
Well, at certain prices, you will change people's behavior. If it gets up to $200 a barrel, we would see some change in people's demand. But one of the things that surprised many of us is that with the increase in prices that we have seen now in gasoline, it doesn't seem to be deterring as all that much in the way of consumption of energy. We're now, the real problem with energy is that it's a global market, not just a U.S. market. And countries that have not, this year we'll have about 73 million new automobiles produced. 15 million of them in the United States, about 22 million of them in Europe, 8 million of them in China. That's up 16% from last year. The previous year it's up 20%. China has now decided that mobility is a wonderful thing and they want to be able to drive, and they're putting in a highway system that will make this, as is India. So the likelihood that we're going to have a trail off in the use of energy, price will have some effect in the short run, but over the long run we're going to have to find either a viable alternative to the internal combustion engine, or we're going to have to find some other way in which to meet our energy needs, because if we stay on the path that we are on right now, it's not a path taking us anywhere worth going.
Good. Thank you. No one has thought more deeply in American journalism about the political challenges that presidents face and how they deal with the politics of change than Joe Klein. Joe has written for several publications since January of 2003. He has had a regular column in Time magazine, which is a must-read as well. I just told you about his writing the cover package for this week's issue on the Democratic race. Joe was, some of you may know him as Mr. Anonymous. Among other things in life, he did write a book called Primary Colors. It was a bestseller inspired by the 1992 political race, and the author was anonymous, and it was some people thought it bore a faint resemblance to a certain candidate that he was following, and it became it created quite a stir. More recently, he's written a book called The Natural, about Bill Clinton, but he's most recently written a book about political consultants, and he brought them down a peg or two in a way which I think a lot of us celebrated. But Joe we're deeply grateful that you were able to make your way here from New York today and join us for a portion of this day. As you think about this, you've heard these very sober assessments of what's ahead. Help us understand, from a political lens, what this means for the next president.
Well, thanks, David. And I probably also should thank the people of Indiana and North Carolina for allowing me to be here today. And to continue some themes that have started, this is the 9th presidential campaign that I've covered as a journalist. I often say that there are no 12-step programs for political junkies. And also picking up on Larry's theme, the first campaign I ever covered was for zoning board in Peabody, Massachusetts. And one of the issues on the table was canine control. And one of the candidates said, we're at a crossroads in the history of canine control in Peabody, Massachusetts. And from that day to this, I haven't covered a campaign where we weren't at the crossroads of something. And I used to push back against that by saying, this is the greatest period of peace and prosperity in the history of the world. We're at the crossroads of nothing. But I changed my position on that on the night of September 11th, 2001, when 9 of my neighbors in the town of Pelham, New York, didn't come home. And I thought, now we have to get serious. I named a character in Primary Colors after I think the political crisis and situation that we're facing now. Orlando Ozio, the governor of New York. Machiavelli said that ozio was the greatest enemy of a republic. Ozio is Italian for indolence. And what Machiavelli was concerned about was, how do you keep a republic coherent? How do you keep the citizenry rigorous during a period of peace and prosperity? Well, we've pretty much had a period of peace and prosperity since the end of World War II. And during that time, voter participation has declined, and we've kind of lost the habits of citizenship. The question is, how do we regain them? Also during that time, during the 40 years that I've been, more or less, that I've been doing this, we've seen the rise, as David said, of a whole new class of individuals who are extremely influential in the political process, that is, pollsters and political consultants. 32 years ago, a 28-year-old graduate of Harvard University, Patrick Cadell, sent a memo to his president-elect, Jimmy Carter, in which he said, "You're going to have to govern if you want to succeed, as if your presidency is a permanent campaign." From that day to this, every president has more or less governed as if it were a permanent campaign. I would argue very much to our detriment. Why? Because, and actually it reached its either peak or a nadir when the current president put Karl Rove in charge of policy. Now, Karl Rove is one of the smartest political consultants I've ever dealt with, but he looks at the lens of politics through from the opposite end of the telescope than a leader should. A political consultant looks at politics this way: how am I going to win the news cycle? Number one. Number two, what's my message of the day? Number three, are we winning the week? And number four, what about the next election? A leader, as we've heard from all the other participants in this panel, has to think long-term, has to think about the problems ahead. And for the last 30 years, in another political cycle, which in this country, we've had leadership, by and large, that bought into Ronald Reagan's line, which was that government isn't part of the solution, government is part of the problem. And I think that going ahead, the next leader, the next president, is going to have to figure out how to strike a balance between his political consultants and the needs of the people and the problems of the future. I am going to keep within 5 minutes. I think that there are several keys here. There are several aspects of the presidency that the current political situation makes very difficult, that the next president is going to have to redefine. I think back to the declaration of war, or actually to President Bush's reaction after September 11th and the subsequent declaration of war against Iraq. I think that the president failed in two regards, whether you agree with his decisions or not. One was, and the most essential one, was an educational response. He didn't tell the public fully what was at stake. He didn't talk about the challenges of the future, both in terms of energy, in terms of budget problems, in terms of security, in terms of sacrifices that were going to have to be made. That's the most important part. He didn't ask for sacrifice of any kind. He asked us to go shopping. And I think that the next president, with over 80% of the American public believing that this country is on the wrong track, the next president is going to have to figure out a way to do something that very few presidents have done during my adult lifetime, and that is deliver bad news. Deliver news about sacrifice. And that doesn't only mean higher taxes, it means a lot of things. It may mean, it may mean a more mandatory form of national service, which is what David and I have talked about
in the past, which may get you, Roger, some of those high-quality young people into government work. It's certainly going to require a level of education. I remember going to a political meeting a couple of years ago, Democratic congressman, and it was a classic kind of union hall sort of thing with ribs and a bunch of union members there. And I remember going around asking people what they thought about the war in Iraq. And one guy says to me, well, you know, Saddam Hussein knocked down the World Trade Center, so we had to go there and get him, but now we've got him, so let's come home. And you just can't have a democracy if you have a citizenry that is as ill-informed as that. You can't have a democracy if you have a media where a whole generation of young people have grown up thinking that serious political discourse is Pat Buchanan and Eleanor Clift yelling at each other on the McLaughlin Group. And so the final point I'd make is that is the most important job of the next president, to educate the public, to tell us what we need to do. You know, when I was growing up, my parents would tell me stories about Franklin Roosevelt, and one of them that they told me was about at the very beginning of the war. Roosevelt went on the air and with a fireside chat, and he told the American people to go out and buy maps and buy boxes of pins so that as our troops progressed across the Pacific and across Europe, they would know where the public would know where our troops were. And as a result, my parents' generation knew more about geography than my children do. Now, it is, I think, job number one. Given all of these challenges, you're not going to be able to succeed in any of these areas unless the next president of the United States takes on the very serious job of educating the public about the situation we're in, about the world we're in, telling them the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, for starters, and putting the challenges that we face in a context. Because if we don't restore some level of rigor to our political system, to our media, to our citizenry, most important of all, I'm going to be a lot more pessimistic than either Larry or Roger. And so, finally, I would say that it's not just a challenge for us. It's a challenge for people like you as well. I mean, and I would close with this. I once went to a presidential cattle show that the Christian Coalition had. And Bill Bennett, the former Secretary of Education, was the ringmaster. And he said to the crowd, "You're going to see a succession of candidates coming up here. And they're going to talk about us and about them. And they're going to talk about good guys and bad guys. And they're going to talk about all the things that they're going to do for you. But in America, there is no us or them. And if they don't ask anything of you, don't give them anything, certainly not your vote." And that's how I would ask you, the leaders, future leaders of the country, current leaders of the country, that's how I'd ask you to view this this presidential campaign. If they don't ask anything of you, then don't give them your vote.
Joe, thank you. Let me follow up quickly on one aspect of this. Washington has become, in so many ways, the phrase you hear there from everyone is dysfunctional. It seems impossible to govern and to get things done in ways that we once thought were within our grasp. Do you think it is possible that through this election we could create a new politics? Whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who is elected, a new politics that would transcend, would move beyond, would help us end this deep polarization that we see in Washington, or are we going to be stuck with this for a while?
Well, I think that there is some cause for optimism, and in that both the likely nominees, John McCain and Barack Obama, have talked and acted in ways that would lead you to expect that they want to work across lines. You know, McCain has a history of being a maverick, of being one of the founders of the Gang of 14 that resolved a major impasse about judicial appointments. And Barack Obama, too, I think that just in his essence, who he is, has been a lifelong quest to kind of resolve the differences inherent in his own body. The fact that, his mother was from Kansas, his father was from Kenya. It's been a very difficult process for him, and to me, one of the great ironies of the last month or two is that it turns out that he can't get the votes of the people who raised him, his Kansas grandparents, white, working, middle-class people. He's going to have to figure out a way to transcend that. And I think that he's shown many instances along the way of not succumbing to, political pandering, not succumbing to his consultants, just as John McCain has. But still, Washington is a city that is run by special interests, consultants, pollsters, who tell politicians a great deal about what they can't do and what they shouldn't do, but not very much about what they can do and what they should do.
All right. Let's open this up for a few minutes. We're going to go just a little later than 10:15, but not too much. But I would invite comment, thought, question from anyone here about this. I could go on and talk to these folks for another hour without any trouble at all. But I do want to make sure if there's someone here who wants to jump in. In fact, I want to actually invite Bill George, if he would. There is Bill George. He and I had a long conversation last night about oil and where the world was. And as you've listened to this, Bill, a man who's on the board of a number of major corporations, and himself he's at the Harvard Business School, teaches there, and was a very enlightened leader of Medtronic for a long time. Bill.
Well, I have particular resonance with the fact that we don't have an educated populace in many ways, and particularly on the subject of energy, and how this war, we need to be integrated at a higher level, and this war is putting tremendous power in the hands of governments that are not necessarily our friends. And I think our populace really doesn't understand how oil prices come about. I think it's quite clear that $126 a barrel oil or even $100 a barrel oil has not got through to the pump. And we're going to see quite a bit higher gas prices.
You say $126 oil has not actually, that high price has not actually worked its way through the system.
No, we're still working off old inventories. And I think there's not any understanding about how this comes about. I do serve on the board of Exxon, and there's no imbalance in supply and demand to speak of. There is growing demand, but there's adequate supplies today. Inventories are fine. But I think as the dollar becomes weaker, people have shifted dramatically their investments to, particularly the hedge funds and sovereign wealth funds have shifted. Larry knows a lot more about this than I do, but shifted a lot more money into oil and other commodities like corn. And this is going to continue to drive the prices dramatically. And so I think we've got to get control over our some of these factors, and one is the deficit spending, and the other is getting control over reducing consumption around the world.
Mm-hmm. This does raise the question, I think, and Barbara Kellerman, I'm sure in a subsequent panel is going to raise the issue of followership. Is it possible in today's politics for the candidates for an incoming president to speak frankly about what we face, to educate and to call for sacrifice? Can you get elected if you tell the truth about what's coming?
Better be able to, or we're in a lot of trouble.
I mean, we've just gone through Ohio where there was a tremendous amount of pandering on trade. I think as Roger would suggest. In Michigan, Mitt Romney promised that he would bring the jobs back, and John McCain said they're not coming back. Mitt Romney won. And so the question becomes: do we have a citizenry that is prepared to hear this is going to be tough, and you're going to need to do certain things? And can you get elected? Can you govern in that situation?
On the citizenry here in 2 or 3 respects.
Okay.
First of all, I defy anyone to watch an episode of West Wing, which was the most highly rated TV show of its era, and then watch an episode of the Beverly Hillbillies, which was the most highly rated TV show of its era. Just watch the 2 episodes and tell me you believe we had a much more sophisticated citizenry about public policy 30 years ago. It's just not true. And if you look at the surveys, it was terrible. 25% of the people who voted for Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire thought they were voting for Joe. I mean, this romantic. It's true. That's a fact.
Larry.
This romanticization of the past in terms of where the citizenry was.
Can I tell you why you're so profoundly wrong about that? It's absolute. When Beverly Hillbillies was the highest rated show in America, we had 3 networks. We had 3 choices. One of the greatest problems that we have as a society now has been if it's the golden age of anything, it's the golden age of marketing. And so now they have 100 choices, and so maybe West Wing is the highest rated show, but it is the highest rated show at a very, very low level. And so, if you do it in the aggregate, I think that there are a hell of a lot more people watching wrestling and sports and MTV and all the options that you never had
I
before. One of the big problems you have in a democracy is that the only time this society comes together is when somebody drives an airplane into the World Trade Center.
Let me say two things. I'll try to state them relatively neutrally. One is, it's a question for legitimate empirical inquiry. What the sophistication and degree of knowledge around public policy is today rather than historical. I think that your supposition that there has been substantial deterioration will not actually stand empirical test, but we can probably both agree that it's a good idea to have empirical test. I think the second issue that we need to face is it would be easier to agree on the merits of telling the truth if there was a bit more consensus on what the truth was. So I don't hold myself out as an expert. I'm not necessarily prepared to assert that my view is more right than Bill George's views, but I think people would probably think both of us had something to say about the question, and I would have said that the view that you could blame high energy prices on speculators was mostly a canard that accounted for a small bit of froth on top of a much larger phenomenon that had to do with what was happening in the Middle East vis-a-vis what was happening in Asia with rapid growth. I'm not here to tell you that I'm confident that I'm right, but one of the problems with, quote, telling the truth so people will explain it is that among those who one might plausibly go to for the truth on these issues, there is actually a very substantial divergence of views. And I actually think a very important attribute of being successful as president is going to be someone who, confronted with substantially different views, delivered with considerable intellectual sophistication around these problems, is going to be good at making judgments about which ones are right and which ones are not. Because in fact, there's much less agreement on truth than many of those who want painful truth told to the people would like to believe.
Larry, let me just ask you a question then. Given the fact that we're now in a global economy where we're competing against other countries, do you think that we need a higher or a continuing level amount of education and information on the part of the public? Do we need a more sophisticated public, or do we need the current level that we have, or the level that you seem to think we've risen from?
I would like to have a more sophisticated public, but I think the whole thing is, I think one needs to be very attentive to what is feasible in this regard. If you'll indulge me in a short story, when I worked advising presidential candidate Dukakis in 1988, I was here as a professor of economics, and everybody would say, so he's for good jobs at good wages, so what's his plan for the S&L crisis? Is he for the trust fund method, or is he for some other method? And he had fuzzed over and evaded the issue. And people would ask me these kinds of questions, people I'd run into in the economics department asked me these kinds of questions constantly. And I got a little tired of it. And so I developed actually a way of responding that at least let me change the subject. I would say to them, okay, I'll answer that in a minute. But first, I have two questions for you. A, what are the MX missile and the midget man? And B, where do the two candidates stand on that issue? Okay, so these were all professors of economics and stuff at Harvard. Those two missile systems, as people here will attest, were the two central defense policy issues at that time. None of them knew the answer. They all said the same thing. Gosh, I don't know. Gosh, something about train tracks, missiles on train tracks. I don't know exactly, but probably Bush is for them, and probably Dukakis is against them, but I don't know. Now, if that was the way Harvard professors interested in public policy were watching that presidential election, I think we probably need a theory that puts a little more emphasis on the word representative in representative democracy than Joe is suggesting. We need campaigns to be more about expression of values at the highest levels, and then reliance on people in a bipartisan way to work on experts, then this idea that we're going to turn this into some model of the Athenian town meeting in which we're going to debate withdrawal strategies or debate the nuances of energy policy.
I don't want to get into
in the political context.
This will be the last thing that I say about this, but you've just contradicted the second problem that you raised, which was the disparity in incomes. And what you're essentially proposing is an electorate that doesn't have the educational capabilities to be citizens. And so if that's the case, they probably won't have the economic capabilities to close the gap between the very wealthy and the poor. I mean, what you've just done is give the single best argument for the kind of autocracy that we're building.
Joe, I got to say something. I yield to no one, and certainly not to you, in my enthusiasm for strengthening the quality of education at every level in the United States. I think the question is how one thinks about what are going to be the most effective political strategies over the next 20 years for bringing about resolution of these problems. And I think political debate that takes place more at the values level. I think if you actually study closely the history of the Marshall Plan, what you'll actually discover is that it had less to do with the fact that we had a fantastic education campaign that caused the public to internalize the values of the Marshall Plan, and more to do with the fact that it was an era when Truman and Marshall and Vandenberg, by all agreeing in a bipartisan, statesman-like way, were actually able to get it done. And so I think one has to think very carefully about what the theory of popular participation in this, and in particular, I would just go back to, if you study the history of the New Deal and all of that, it had to do with the fact that Roosevelt won 40-odd states because people were miserable. It didn't have a thing to do with the substance of his presidential campaign, which was all about how he was going to reduce the budget deficit because Hoover was spending too much. And so you just need to think hard about where you're looking for your improvement. And I think it's strong mandates around values implemented wisely that have produced successes in American politics, and this idea that it's concrete discussions of issues that educate is just not the record of the
That's not what
successes.
I'm saying at all. And what do you mean by values? I mean, you know,
Let me try two facts as part of this, because I think actually, David, this will bleed through to some of the other
Yeah,
conversations.
and we also need to wrap up here, yeah.
The question of, or the theories of democracy is actually what's underneath this discussion, and leadership in democracy. And in the context of the primaries recently, where Senator Clinton was proposing and McCain, the gas holiday,
Right.
And Obama said it was a gimmick, I then took to look at some information about the voter. So, what percentage of Americans can identify their two senators? Okay. So the answer is less than half. That's now, currently. I don't know whether it's more or less than it was before. I'm just saying, how is it currently? And secondly, if only college-educated people's votes were counted, which Democrat would have won, starting with Roosevelt? And the answer is none. Well, those are just two facts.
Interesting. Let me just say, we obviously these conversations that we've started this morning could go on, and that's the purpose of the rest of the day. I do believe that I agree with Larry in one fundamental way, and that is, I do think that people sensed with, for example, the Marshall Plan, the fact that people who were quite disparate came together in a spirit of this is really important was as critical to getting the Marshall Plan passed. Marshall Plan started out with 18% support in the Gallup poll. It was very, very unpopular. People thought it was expensive and weren't sure they wanted to do it, and the like. And it was really the formation of a bipartisan unity group behind the Marshall Plan with Vandenberg and others supporting it that led to its passage and people doing some things that they thought were going to be tough and were expensive. And the question that hangs over this campaign, it seems to me, and this next president, and one that I hope we will further discuss, is how does a president, how does a team, how does an administration create a willingness on the part of the public to embrace some very tough medicine, to things that we're not going to find easy. All of us here who go back to the Clinton years remember how hard it was in the beginning when he had, and Larry, you'll remember this well, in the days as you were working up to become Treasury Secretary, he proposed a nickel a gallon. In fact, he first started looking at a carbon tax. Al Gore wanted him to put forward a carbon tax, and he said, he decided against that. But he put forward a nickel a gallon increase on the gasoline tax. And that was hugely contentious. He had to twist a lot of arms among Democrats in the House of Representatives, some of whom went down in the 1994 election over walking the plank on energy prices. And what we're talking about now is something that far exceeds in the way of belt tightening, of giving up things, whether it be on entitlement reform, as Roger Porter has talked about and Larry have talked about, and Social Security or Medicare, but dealing with energy, changing our habits, putting price on carbon, the kind of issues we may need sacrifice to deal with Iran. There are a lot of issues here that are in a highly polarized society are going to require a president to put together coalitions and ask for broad sort of public willingness to do things that have been regarded as very difficult, almost beyond the pale. That's the reason some of these problems haven't been solved for so long. How does a president actually do that? And I think that's going to be the leadership challenge that we're going to face. Roger.
Alexander Hamilton, perhaps the biggest proponent of a strong executive, referred in the Federalist Papers to this new office that we were thinking about creating as providing the energizing element in the
Right.
government. And his vision of what this office would be is as true today as it was then. If you look at our political system, the place which is going to be the energizing element in it is going to be the president. It is going to be the president that we have to look to decide, perhaps the most important thing we have to decide as a country, which is what are our priorities going to be? Because we cannot do everything simultaneously. We have to choose. Secondly, our system is one in which we have decided to divide, distribute, diffuse, and fragment power because we are still very cautious as a people about putting too much concentrated power in any one set of hands. We have clung to this idea for over 2 centuries, I think wisely. But it requires the person not only to provide the energizing element and the vision and the set of priorities, but he has got to demonstrate the capacity that he can work with the rest of the government. And that is a very difficult proposition in our time, as for all the reasons that everyone in this room understands. I think it has been President Bush's greatest disappointment that he hoped when he came to Washington that he could do what he had managed to do in Texas, and that is work across party lines, and he has acknowledged that that has proven to be more challenging and more difficult than he anticipated. Third, I totally agree that people are so busy that the likelihood that any the general public is going to be knowledgeable in detail about any particular issue is simply not going to be the case. But that does not mean that we do not need to have a president and a leader who is prepared to explain and articulate and help people understand why he's taking us where he is. And then people can decide whether or not they're willing to go along with it. And that's going to take a lot of candor and honesty on his part to help us understand what in fact are our real choices. And therefore, if we have a president who is willing to be the energizing element, who has the ability and capacity to work across party lines, and who is prepared to do the very tough, arduous job of explaining to people, then it seems to me we've got a pretty good future.
I think you know now why Roger Porter teaches one of the most popular classes here for undergraduates. It's on the American presidency.
Let me,
Final point, I'm joking.
let me just throw in a little bit of, Larry wants, a little bit of data. Those of you who are in the field of education know about the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And Larry, the literacy scores have been dropping steadily to the point where only a quarter of our graduating seniors are considered proficient in English. Proficient is essentially literate. We're graduating, more than half can't read a train schedule. So there has been a decline in rigor in the population, number one. Number two, you're right, values are an important part of an election. And low information signaling, whether, the candidate, knocks back shots of Crown Royal as Hillary Clinton did, or plays 3-on-3 basketball as Barack Obama did. You have to, that's the threshold. You have to let people know that you're one of them. The reason why Democrats have been having trouble in recent elections, like John Kerry, is that they seemed aloof and elite. But that's the threshold level. Once you establish that, you have a job, if you want to be a leader of a democracy, to do exactly what Roger Porter just said. And that is to educate people and not to have, and it's up to us in the media to be sure that we don't have elections that that turn on whether or not a candidate windsurfs. So I think that values are important, low information signaling is important, but at this point, when we're facing some real problems, intellectual leadership and education are absolutely crucial.
I couldn't agree more on the importance of general education, on the importance of intellectual leadership. But I have to say there's an element of this, and it's probably what set me off a little bit. Groups like this do tend, where I would guess, looking around this room, that 90-odd% of the people in this room are in the one way or another connected to the top 1% of the income distribution. It is a problem when groups like this, who have benefited $500,000 a year on average, $640 billion transferred, now rev themselves up that the major solution to the problem is around shared sacrifice of everybody. That is a problem. There is a different view that more of the sacrifice should be coming from those who have benefited most substantially. If you think about the inequality issue, if you think about the healthcare issue, if you think about some of the things you can do on energy, if you think about some of the issues around the size of government to do things about education, it is a real choice. And that is something that I think really does have to be faced in the context of this election.
Wow, this conversation clearly could continue, but I think it has gotten us off to a wonderfully interesting, provocative start. And I want to thank, if you will join me in thanking Larry Summers, Allison, Roger Porter, Joe Klein.